A river in southern Turkey, on a hot June afternoon in the year 1190, gives up the body of the most powerful man in Europe. The water there is not deep. In some places it barely reaches a grown man's waist. And yet the old emperor is face down in it, his armor or his wet clothes dragging him, and by the time the knights closest to him understand what is happening, Frederick I, Holy Roman Emperor, the man the Italians would one day nickname Barbarossa for his red beard, is already gone. He has crossed half of Europe and most of Anatolia to reach the Holy Land. He has fought his way through mountains and ambushes and starvation, and he dies in a stream you could wade across without getting your shirt wet. His men do not know what to do with him. That part comes later, and it is honestly one of the strangest things you will hear today, because what they end up doing to his corpse is so far outside what we expect of grief that it has its own Latin name. We will get there. But first, hello, welcome in. Thank you for being here. And a real thank you to everyone who supports the channel and keeps these long ones possible. You make a genuine difference, and I don't say that lightly. Settle in. This is a long one, and it goes to some dark places. And before we get going properly, do me a small favor and let me know down in the comments where you're listening from. I love seeing it. Late night in a kitchen somewhere, a long drive, headphones on a train. Doesn't matter, just tell me what corner of the world you're in. It always surprises me. Now, 5 medieval mysteries, and I mean genuine mysteries, the kind that still have historians arguing in footnotes and shaking their heads at conferences. A drowned emperor whose bones nobody can find. A holy sword that may or may not belong to the man whose name it carries. A gold coin from an English king with the Muslim profession of faith stamped right across it. A 70-meter strip of embroidery that shows a man dying in a way nobody can quite agree on. And a fleet of ships that supposedly vanished off the coast of France with the treasure of a doomed holy order in the hold. Some of these are mysteries in the true sense. Real questions with answers we've simply lost and probably won't ever recover. Some of them are mysteries we more or less invented ourselves, took a thin scrap of evidence and built a cathedral of legend on top of it, and then half believed our own story until it became impossible to see the small fact buried underneath. Both kinds are worth our time tonight. We'll start with the emperor in the river, because his is the one where the bare facts are mostly solid, and it's the human details around them, what his men did with him afterward, where he ended up, what people refuse to believe about his death, that turn out to be the strangest part. Frederick was already old by the standards of his century when he set out to die in that river. Born around December of 1122, he had been King of Germany since 1152 and Holy Roman Emperor since 1155, crowned by the Pope in Rome with all the ceremony that title demanded, though the coronation itself nearly turned into a massacre when the Roman crowd rioted and his men had to cut their way out of the city, leaving the streets full of dead before the new emperor had worn his crown a full day. He spent his life in the saddle and in argument. 6 separate campaigns down into Italy, trying to bend the rich, proud northern cities to his will, and the Italians fought him at every turn. In one of those campaigns, his army was gutted not by a battle, but by an epidemic. a sudden plague that swept through the German ranks outside Rome in the summer heat and killed thousands of his best men in a matter of days, so that he had to retreat north over the Alps with the survivors, a foretaste of how disease, more than swords, would eventually unmake his great crusade. He got beaten badly at Legnano in 1176 by the combined militias of the Lombard League, unhorsed in the fighting and briefly believed dead, a humiliation he never fully shook off. And he had Charlemagne dug up and declared a saint in 1165 and reburied the old conqueror's bones in a casket of gold and silver at Aachen, partly because tying himself to Charlemagne was good politics, the surest way to say I am the true heir of the first great emperor, and partly, you suspect, because Frederick genuinely saw himself as that kind of figure, the restorer of a vanished imperial glory. Hold that thought about Charlemagne's bones, by the way. It comes back in the next story in a way I find quietly grim. By the time Jerusalem fell to Saladin in 1187, Frederick was somewhere in his 60s, which in the 12th century made him an old man, a grandfather, a relic of an earlier age of kings. And he took the cross anyway. In March of 1188, in the cathedral at Mainz, at an assembly they called the Court of Christ, the old emperor publicly swore to go and take Jerusalem back. He had actually been on crusade once before, decades earlier, as a young man on the disastrous Second Crusade, so he knew exactly what he was signing up for. He'd watched a crusade fall apart with his own eyes. He knew the distances. He knew the heat, the disease, the way a great army turns into a column of dying men far from home. He went anyway. You can read that as faith or as stubbornness, or as an old man wanting one more great deed before the end, and probably it was all three tangled together. The army he gathered was enormous, or at least the chroniclers want us to believe it was enormous. You'll see numbers thrown around like 80,000, 100,000, 150,000. One account cheerfully gives 20,000 knights and 80,000 on foot. Medieval writers were not great with crowds, and a big number was a way of saying important rather than a real head count, so most historians today quietly bring that down to something like 15 or 20,000 fighting men, which is still one of the largest forces of the entire crusading era. He set out from Regensburg in May of 1189 and pointed the whole mass of them east, overland, the hard way, through the Balkans and Byzantine territory and into the teeth of Anatolia. The march was brutal long before the river. The Byzantine emperor, who was supposed to be a fellow Christian and an ally, treated Frederick's army like an invasion, which from a certain angle it was, and there was so much friction that they ended up signing a treaty at Adrianople in February of 1190, just to get permission to keep moving. Then came the crossing into Asia Minor, and the Turks, and the heat, and the hunger. The country they marched through had been picked clean, sometimes by the Turks deliberately, who knew that an army of that size would starve faster than it could be beaten. The Germans ate their pack animals. When the pack animals ran out, they ate the war horses, the expensive trained destriers that a knight valued almost like family. And a knight who eats his own horse is a knight who has run out of every other option. Men who fell behind the column were picked off by Turkish raiders who shadowed the army for hundreds of miles, harassing the edges, killing stragglers, never quite committing to a full battle, just bleeding the host a little more every single day. The water was bad. The sickness moved through the camp the way sickness always did in a crowded medieval army, dysentery and fever loosening men's bowels and burning them up, so that the line of march left a trail of shallow graves and unburied dead stretching back the way they'd come. There's a moment recorded where the army was so exhausted and demoralized, picking its way through that hostile, emptied country, that Frederick is supposed to have turned to his men and said something like, "Why do we hesitate? What is there to fear? Christ reigns, Christ conquers, Christ commands." Whether he said it exactly that way or a chronicler tidied it up afterward, that's the voice they remembered him in. The stubborn old man at the front, refusing to be afraid in a place that gave every reason to be. They won battles they had no business winning. At Philomelion in early May, then at Iconium, modern Konya, on the 18th of May, they fought a battle that should not have gone their way and won it, and then stormed the city itself and put much of it to the sword. The chroniclers describe the streets running with the dead, the savage sacking that crusading armies inflicted when they finally broke into a place after weeks of being hunted and starved. All that fear and hunger and grief for dead friends turning into something ugly the moment the walls came down. The road to the Holy Land was, for the first time in the whole nightmare campaign, starting to look open. Saladin, hearing that this immense German army was grinding toward him and could not be stopped, was genuinely frightened. He summoned his commanders and began tearing down the walls of his own coastal cities, Acre, Sidon, others, so that if Frederick reached them and took them, the Germans couldn't hold them against a counterattack. A man does not demolish his own fortresses unless he believes the thing coming for him is worse than leaving himself defenseless. That's the measure of the dread the old emperor cast ahead of himself across hundreds of miles he never reached. And then the river. The 10th of June, 1190. The army reached the Salef, which today is called the Göksu, near a town called Silifke, in the region the medieval writers called Cilicia. What happened next is where our sources stop agreeing with each other. And that disagreement is the whole reason this counts as a mystery rather than just a sad accident. The fullest account we have comes from a source usually credited to a man called Ansbert, though that name itself is a bit of a guess attached centuries later, and the text is probably stitched together from more than one eyewitness. In that version, the emperor, against the advice of the people around him, wanted to cool off in the river. He'd been baked by the Anatolian sun for weeks. He went into the water, lightly dressed, to swim or to bathe, and the current, stronger than it looked, took him. Another chronicler, Otto of Saint-Blasien, tells it differently. In his telling, Frederick was impatient, as he always was, and tried to cross the river on horseback to push the advance forward faster, and his horse lost its footing in the flow and threw him, and the water did the rest. Then you have Ibn al-Athir, the great Muslim historian, writing from the other side of the war, and he's blunt about it. He says the king went down to the river to wash himself and drowned at a spot where the water wasn't even up to his waist. And he adds, with the satisfaction of a man whose enemy has just removed himself from the board, that God saved them from the evil of this king. Which is it then, swimming or fording, lightly clothed or in armor? Did his heart simply stop in the cold mountain snowmelt after weeks of heat, an old man's body failing in the shock of it, and the drowning came after? The honest answer is that we cannot fully reconcile the accounts, and people have been trying for 800 years. There's a physical detail in there worth sitting with, though, because it makes the most sense of an old man dying in shallow water. The Salef in June ran off the mountains, and mountain rivers in early summer carry the melt of the winter snows, which means the water would have been shockingly, brutally cold even on a baking hot day. A man in his late 60s, sun-cooked and exhausted after months of starvation and disease on the march, plunging suddenly into that kind of cold, is a man whose heart can simply seize. The body goes into shock. The chest locks. He doesn't need deep water to drown after that. He only needs to be face down and unable to lift himself, in a current strong enough to keep him there, and a stream that came up to his waist would do it perfectly well. They all agree on the essentials anyway. Sudden, shallow, fatal. A man who had survived everything the journey could throw at him, undone in minutes by a stretch of water his own foot soldiers could have waded across without wetting their belts. The records don't let us stand on the bank and watch it happen the way we'd want to. They give us fragments, and the fragments don't fit. The men closest to him pulled him out, and by every account it was already far too late, the old emperor limp and gone, dragged up onto the gravel of a riverbank in a country none of them belonged in. What is not in dispute is what came next, and this is the part I promised you. They could not simply dig a hole and bury him where he fell. He was the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, the anointed heir of Charlemagne, and a man like that does not get left in foreign dirt beside a river in Cilicia. His remains belonged at home, in Germany, in consecrated imperial ground, under a great church where his people could come and kneel. But it was June, in the south of Anatolia, and the heat was the kind that turns a body fast, and the nearest patch of German soil was a continent away. The first thing they tried was preservation. They opened him up, removed the organs, and packed what was left in vinegar to try to hold off the rot long enough to carry him onward. It didn't work. The decay had already taken hold, the flesh softening and going in the heat faster than any amount of vinegar could check. And the men around him had to face the fact that the emperor was coming apart in front of them and would be unrecognizable, unmovable, a horror rather than a relic, long before they ever reached home. And so they did what the Germans of that era did with their great men who died too far from home to carry whole. They boiled him. The practice had a settled name, the Mos Teutonicus, the German custom, and a 13th century writer named Boncompagno described it without flinching. The Germans, he wrote, take the bodies of their important men who die in foreign lands, remove the intestines, and boil the rest in great cauldrons until all the flesh and sinew and gristle separates cleanly from the bone. Then they wash the bones in fragrant wine, sprinkle them with spices, and carry them home. That is what happened to Frederick Barbarossa, the most powerful ruler in Christendom, the man whose approach had Saladin demolishing his own fortresses, the old crusader who told his men to fear nothing because Christ commanded, was taken apart at the joints and simmered down in a cauldron to a clean white skeleton by his own grieving, practical followers, on a riverbank in a country that wasn't his, so that some portion of him could still make the journey to consecrated ground. There's no record of who lit that fire or who stood over the cauldron, and maybe that's a mercy, because somebody had to, and somebody had to watch. It did not all go to the same place, and this is where he scatters. The boiled flesh, the soft remains that came out of the cauldron, was buried in the Cathedral of St. Peter in Antioch, a first grave for an emperor who was meant to lie in Germany. The bones, the clean white part they actually wanted to carry all the way to Jerusalem and lay in the holiest ground in the world, never came close to making it that far. The army that was carrying them fell apart long before Jerusalem, and most accounts have the bones ending up in the cathedral at Tyre on the Lebanese coast, set down in a city that wasn't the destination because the destination was never reached, and the heart and the inner organs, removed before the boiling the way the custom required, were laid to rest at Tarsus. So you end up with one man in 3 cities, none of them his own country, none of them the place he was trying to reach. His flesh in one church, his bones in another, his heart in a third. An emperor distributed across the eastern Mediterranean like a relic divided among shrines. And every one of those 3 cities was then or soon to be lost, fought over, shaken apart by earthquakes, sacked, rebuilt, conquered again. Nobody today can stand at a grave and say, "Here, this is Barbarossa," the way you can stand over almost any other emperor of his stature. The cathedral at Antioch that held his flesh was destroyed. The church at Tyre that held his bones is gone. In the 1870s, in the flush of German national feeling after the country was finally united into one empire, a historian and politician named Sepp got himself backed by Bismarck himself and led an expedition all the way to Tyre to find the old emperor's bones and bring them home in triumph to be enshrined in Cologne, a kind of national pilgrimage to recover a founding father. He dug, he searched, he found nothing at all. The bones of one of the best documented men of the entire 12th century, an emperor whose every campaign was written down, had simply dissolved into the rubble and the soil of 3 ruined cities, leaving the men who came looking for him 800 years later, standing in the dirt with empty hands. And the army he left behind fell apart almost immediately. You have to understand what his death did to the men standing around in that river valley. They had crossed the known world on the strength of this one old man's will. He was the reason. He was the proof, walking and breathing in front of them, that God wanted this, that the whole impossible journey would be vindicated at the end. And now God had let him drown in a creek without so much as a battle wound to show for it. No Saracen sword, no glorious last stand, just an old man face down in cold water on an ordinary afternoon. The effect on morale was total and immediate. Some of the Germans simply turned around and started the long walk home, abandoning the crusade on the spot, because the thing they'd come to do no longer seemed possible without him. Some, the chroniclers say, fell into a despair so complete that they took their own lives, unable to make sense of a God who would do this to them after everything, after the starvation and the dead friends and the 1,000 miles. Others lost their faith outright in their grief, and a few are even said to have abandoned Christianity altogether, which for a crusader is about as far down as a soul can fall. Then the sickness came, as it always did. Disease swept through the grieving, leaderless host as it staggered on toward Antioch and thinned the survivors further, fever and dysentery doing to the living what the river had done to the emperor. By the time the remnant reached Acre, where the rest of the Third Crusade was gathering for the great effort against Saladin, the immense German army of 15 or 20,000 had melted down to maybe 5,000 exhausted, mourning men, a third of what had set out, dragging the boiled bones of their emperor with them in a box. The German contribution to the crusade, the army that had Saladin tearing down his own city walls in fear of its approach, effectively died in that water with the old man who led it. Saladin, when the news reached him, understood his luck perfectly. The Muslim chroniclers treated Frederick's death as nothing less than a gift from heaven, the removal of the one Western king they had genuinely feared, and you can hardly blame them, because the man who'd been coming to take Jerusalem from them had instead been handed back to God by a river before he ever laid eyes on the city. But people could not accept that he was simply dead. There was no grave to visit, no body to mourn over, nothing solid to close the story, and absence has a way of breeding legend. Over the centuries, a story grew up, originally attached to his grandson and then drifting onto Frederick himself, that the old emperor never died at all, that he sleeps deep inside a mountain in Germany called the Kyffhäuser, seated at a stone table, his great red beard grown long enough to wind around it or grow through it. Every 100 years he stirs and sends a boy out to see whether the ravens are still circling the peak, and as long as they are, he settles back down to sleep. One day, the story goes, an eagle will drive the ravens off, and the old man will wake for good and walk out of the mountain and make Germany glorious again. The brothers Grimm wrote it down. A poet named Rückert put it into verse in 1817. And much later, men with far darker intentions reached for that sleeping emperor too. When Hitler's generals needed a name for the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, they called it Operation Barbarossa. The drowned old man in the river had become a symbol that would not stay buried, mostly because his actual body never could be. The boiling, by the way, wasn't some one-off act of desperation invented on the spot. The German custom Boncompagno described was practiced on other great men too, which is part of why it had a settled name and a settled method. A bishop or a noble who died on campaign, far from the church or the family vault where his bones were meant to rest, could be reduced this way, cauldron and spices and a long walk home with the skeleton in a chest. The church eventually grew uneasy with it. A century or so after Frederick, Pope Boniface VIII issued a furious decree against the practice, calling it an abomination, horrified at the idea of Christian bodies being butchered and boiled like meat, and the custom slowly fell out of use. But in 1190, On that riverbank, with the emperor's flesh already turning in the heat, and no other way to carry him home, his men did what their world told them to do with a great man who died too far away. They built the fire and filled the cauldron and went to work on the body of the most powerful ruler in Christendom, and you can only hope they did it at night, away from the rank and file, because an army that has just lost its reason for existing does not need to watch its emperor being simmered down to his bones. It's a fitting bridge in a way, because the man Frederick admired most, the man whose bones he dug up and gilded, has his own object that nobody can pin down. Frederick wanted to be Charlemagne. So let's go and look at Charlemagne's sword, and the strange fact that we cannot say for certain we have ever held it. The sword has a name, Joyeuse, which means joyful or joyous, and it belonged, the stories insist, to Charlemagne himself, the Frankish king who by the year 800 had stitched together most of Western Europe and gotten himself crowned emperor by the Pope on Christmas Day. In the old French epic, the Song of Roland, the poet describes Charlemagne arming for war and buckling on Joyeuse, and there's this lovely strange line about how the blade changed colour 30 times a day, 30 fresh hues, never the same shade twice. The poem goes further. It claims that set into the pommel, the rounded weight at the end of the hilt, was a fragment of the Holy Lance, the very spear point that a Roman soldier pushed into the side of Christ on the cross. So the sword wasn't just a weapon, it was a reliquary you could kill a man with. The poem even says the French battle cry, Montjoie, came from the sword's name, that men ran into battle screaming a word that meant, essentially, Joyeuse, this blade, this emperor, this holy thing on the end of his arm. That's the legend, glowing and golden and completely impossible to verify. And the sword wasn't the only enchanted blade in Charlemagne's world, because the same story cycle gave a sword to his greatest knight too. Roland, the hero whose death at the pass of Roncevaux is the whole heart of the Song of Roland, carried a sword called Durendal, and that one was supposed to be even more sacred than the emperor's, with relics sealed inside its golden hilt, a tooth of Saint Peter, blood of Saint Basil, a hair of Saint Denise, a scrap of the Virgin's robe. As Roland lies dying at the pass, betrayed, his rearguard slaughtered around him, he tries to destroy the sword so it won't fall into enemy hands, smashing it against a great rock again and again, and the rock splits, but the blade won't break. There's a place in southern France, Rocamadour, where a sword is wedged high in a cliff face to this day, and the locals will tell you it's Durendal, hurled there by the dying hero. It almost certainly isn't. It's a much later piece of iron, but the story is so much better than the truth that the truth never really stood a chance. The point of all of it, Joyeuse and Durendal both, is that these men and their weapons were imagined as carrying pieces of God around with them, swords that were half reliquary, so that to swing one was to swing the saints. Now here's the object that's actually sitting in a glass case. In the Louvre, in Paris, there is a sword that has been called Joyeuse for centuries. For a very long stretch of French history, it was the coronation sword. When a new king of France was crowned at Reims, this blade went with him into the cathedral, carried point up in procession ahead of him, a piece of Charlemagne's own glory laid into the hands of each new king to say, in front of God and the assembled nobility, that the line ran unbroken from the great emperor down to this man here. From Philip III in 1270 all the way to Charles X in 1825, that sword was in the room for more than 500 years of crownings, and many of the men who held it came to ends as grim as anything in these stories. The sword was at the coronation of kings who'd later be stabbed to death by assassins, kings who'd go mad, kings who'd be driven from their thrones. Napoleon had it carried at his coronation in 1804 in Notre Dame, the same Napoleon who was busy inventing himself as a new kind of emperor and reached back across 1,000 years to borrow the old Frankish one's shadow, only to die in exile on a rock in the South Atlantic. The last king ever crowned with joyeuse, Charles X, was chased off the throne by revolution within 5 years and died in exile too. For an object meant to promise an unbroken eternal line, it presided over an awful lot of broken ones. For a working ceremonial relic, this sword has stood in the room for some of the most theatrical and some of the most doomed moments in European history. And when you actually take it apart, expert by expert, the problem becomes clear. It is not one sword. It is several swords worth of parts from several different centuries, assembled and reassembled over hundreds of years into a single ceremonial whole, a thing that was repaired and reworked every time it needed to look impressive for another crowning. The blade is one element, probably from around the 10th or 11th century, though the experts have fought over even that. One early scholar looked at it and argued it could be early 9th century, which would drag it right up against Charlemagne's own lifetime and leave the door open, just a crack, to it being real. Another expert examined the same blade and put it in the early 13th century, 400 years too late, a relic of a completely different age dressed up in an older emperor's name. The crossguard, the bar that protects the hand with its 2 little winged dragons facing away from each other, is 12th century work, the dragons themselves a giveaway of the period. The pommel, the very piece the old legend insists held the fragment of the Holy Lance, is worked in a Scandinavian style and may actually be the oldest single part of the whole assembly, older than the blade it now caps. And on top of all that, some historians have argued that the genuine medieval blade was quietly removed and replaced with a copy back around the time of Napoleon's coronation in 1804, swapped out for safety or for show, so that even the metal you'd see today might be a 19th century stand-in for a medieval stand-in for a sword that probably never belonged to Charlemagne in the first place. Layers on layers, each one claiming to be the thing underneath it. Stand in the Louvre and look at joyeuse, and you are looking at something genuinely old, genuinely precious, genuinely carried in the crowning of real kings for more than 500 years. You are almost certainly not looking at anything Charlemagne's hand ever closed around. The power of the object was never really about whether it was authentic. It was about continuity. The unbroken line you could pretend ran straight from the great emperor's grip down to the grip of each new king, and the sword was the prop that made the pretense solid enough to kneel in front of, even though it was bolted together from spare parts centuries after the man it pointed back to had crumbled to nothing in his tomb at Aachen. Which leaves the obvious question hanging. If the Louvre sword isn't his, where is the real one? And the honest answer is that nobody knows, and it's entirely possible there never was a single object we'd recognize as the sword. There's a second contender too, and it muddies things further. Over in Vienna, in the imperial treasury, the Schatzkammer, there's a curved blade traditionally called the saber of Charlemagne, and for centuries it was part of the imperial regalia used in the ceremony of making new kings at Aachen, the very city where Charlemagne is buried. The trouble is that when experts actually examined it, the saber turned out to be an Eastern European weapon, a curved cavalry blade of a type made by Magyar or steppe craftsmen, dated to the first half of the 10th century. Charlemagne died in 814. The man was over 100 years in the ground before that saber was forged. The story attached to it says that the Emperor Otto III recovered it around the year 1000 when he opened Charlemagne's tomb. And that scene, if any version of it is true, is genuinely unsettling. The chronicles say Otto, young and a bit obsessed with the great ancestor, had the vault at Aachen opened and went down into it, and found Charlemagne not laid out flat in a coffin like an ordinary corpse, but seated, enthroned, upright in death, dressed in his imperial robes, a crown on the skull, a scepter in the bones of his hand, the body nearly 200 years gone, and yet arranged to receive a visitor. One account says the fingernails had grown through the gloves. Otto is supposed to have taken something from the tomb, a tooth in some tellings, a piece of the regalia in others, and then sealed it back up. A living emperor robbing a dead one of relics because proximity to Charlemagne was its own kind of power. Whatever Otto pulled out of that vault, though, it was not the saber now in Vienna. The saber probably came into the treasure as war loot or tribute from the eastern frontier and got Charlemagne's name attached to it later, because a holy object needs a holy owner, and there was no holier owner to claim. Two swords then, in two countries, both carried for centuries as Charlemagne's, and neither of them actually his. The real one, the sword the living emperor wore on his hip, if there ever was one single object we'd recognize as that sword, slipped out of the record somewhere in the long dark between his death and the first time anyone wrote down a description of a relic. What's left are these gorgeous composite stand-ins, the Paris blade bolted together from spare centuries, the Vienna saber forged by horsemen. Charlemagne never met, swords that mean Charlemagne to everyone who looks at them without ever once having touched him, and the relic in the pommel, the splinter of the spear that opened Christ's side on the cross, that lives only in the poem, never in any object you could test. It's a beautiful thing to imagine, an emperor riding into battle with a fragment of the crucifixion sealed in the hilt of his sword. The holiest wound in Christianity carried on the arm of the holiest king in the West. But it stays exactly where the best legends stay, just on the far side of proof, close enough to ache for and too far to ever quite hold. From a sword that pretends to a holy relic, we go to a small disc of gold that pretends to be something it very much is not. And the man who made it almost certainly had no idea what he'd actually done. The king is Offa, ruler of Mercia, the Midland kingdom that for a while in the 8th century was the most powerful patch of ground in England. Offa was not a gentle man. He held his power the way ambitious men held power in that century, with a hard hand and a long memory, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records one episode that tells you what he was capable of. In the year 794, the Chronicle says, Offa ordered the head of King Ethelbert to be struck off. Ethelbert was the young king of East Anglia, a neighbouring ruler, and by some accounts he had come to Offa's court more or less as a guest, possibly to marry one of Offa's daughters, riding south in good faith to bind two kingdoms together with a wedding. He left it as a headless corpse. The later legends that grew up around the killing got lurid in the way these stories do. One version has Offa's men luring the young king into a richly prepared chamber, a seat of honor over a hidden pit, the chair giving way beneath him so he tumbled into the dark, where the killers waited to smother him or cut his head off below the floor while the feast went on overhead. Whether any of that machinery is real or just the embroidery of horrified monks writing generations later, the bare fact in the Chronicle is bad enough. A guest king, come to marry into the family, beheaded under his host's roof. It is, as far as historians can tell, the only time one Anglo-Saxon king is recorded executing another reigning king like that. A vassal ruler killed at the court of the man who was supposed to be brokering a marriage with him. Later writers tried to soften the blame by pinning the treachery on Offa's wife, Sinethryth, casting her as the schemer who whispered the plan into the king's ear. But the order, in the end, was the king's. Ethelbert was later treated as a saint and a martyr, his shrine drawing pilgrims at Hereford. The murdered young man transformed by the people who remembered him into something holy, which is often what happens to the innocent dead of a powerful man's reign. There's a grim little coda to it too. When Offa's own son and heir, Ecgfrith, died after barely 140 days on the throne, the scholar Alcuin, who knew the family well and corresponded with it, wrote that the boy hadn't died for his own sins, but for the blood his father had spilled to clear the path for him. The killing of Ethelbert, in other words, was understood even at the time as a debt, and the debt was collected on the next generation. Offa schemed and killed to hand his son an unchallenged crown, and the son wore it for less than 5 months before following his father's victims into the ground. Even Offa's grave didn't keep. He was buried at Bedford, and a later chronicler claimed the river there flooded its banks, broke into the tomb, and carried the old king's bones away, so that the man who had a guest beheaded under his own roof ended up, like Barbarossa, without a resting place anyone could find. This is the man who minted the coin. Around the year 774, Offa's moneyers struck a gold piece, and at first glance it's a beautiful object, dense with elegant Arabic script flowing around both faces. Look closer, and it gets strange. The Arabic is a near-exact copy of an Abbasid gold dinar, the standard coin of the Islamic Empire centered on Baghdad, specifically a dinar of the Caliph al-Mansur, dated to the Islamic year 157, which lands around 773 or 74 in our calendar. The Arabic on Offa's coin includes the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith, the words that there is no God but God, and that Muhammad is the messenger of God. The central statement of Islam, copied onto a coin struck for a Christian Anglo-Saxon king who had probably never met a Muslim in his life. The ambition behind a thing like that makes more sense once you remember who Offa measured himself against. His great contemporary across the channel was Charlemagne, the same Charlemagne whose sword and tomb we were just standing over, and the two men corresponded as something close to equals, which tells you exactly how high Offa rated himself. They negotiated a marriage between their children at one point, and when Charlemagne suggested his son should marry one of Offa's daughters, Offa shot back that fine, but only if his own son could marry one of Charlemagne's daughters in return, an answer so presumptuous that Charlemagne reportedly took offense and closed the channel ports to English traders for a while in irritation. This was a king who would not be looked down on by the most powerful man in Europe. So a coin modelled on the gold of the Abbasid Caliphate, the wealthiest and most sophisticated power in the known world, fits the man. Offa wanted his money to look like it belonged on the same shelf as the great currencies of the age, the coins that moved through the markets of Baghdad and Cairo and the whole rich south, because that was the company he believed he kept. And then, stamped right into the middle of all that flowing Arabic, in plain Latin letters, are the words Offa Rex, Offa, King. Placed there upside down, sideways to the Arabic, jammed in without any sense of how it related to the words around it. The man who cut the die clearly could not read a single character of what he was copying. He treated the Arabic as decoration, a handsome pattern to be reproduced as faithfully as a careful craftsman could manage, and he got some of it wrong, garbled a word here and there, because to him it was shapes, not language. He had no idea he was stamping the Muslim profession of faith onto his Christian king's money. He had no idea, presumably, that he was declaring in gold and Arabic that there is no God but Allah, on a coin that also said, the other way up, Offa the King. Why? That's the mystery, and it's a real one, not a manufactured one. The British Museum, which holds the coin today, is admirably honest about it and basically says the purpose is uncertain. The coin first turns up in the historical record in Rome centuries later, which has led some people to suggest it was meant from the start as a payment or a gift to the Pope. And Offa really did have a financial relationship with Rome. He's the king credited with founding, or at least formalizing, the annual payment from England to the papacy that later got called Peter's Pence, a yearly sum sent south to the Holy See, and he negotiated directly with the Pope to get a new archbishopric set up in his own kingdom at Lichfield, breaking the power of Canterbury, which was the sort of favour you paid for. So a coin of Offa's turning up in Rome isn't strange in itself. Money of his was meant to go there. But the museum points out the obvious problem with the gift idea, gently. It is very hard to imagine a Christian king deliberately choosing to send the Pope, of all people, in the holiest city in the Western world, a gold coin that announces in clear Arabic that there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger. You do not hand the head of the church a coin proclaiming the creed of Islam, not on purpose, not if you understand what it says. So the gift theory runs straight into the words on the metal, and it can only survive if you assume nobody on the English end could read those words, which, as it happens, is exactly what the rest of the coin tells us. The likelier explanations are less dramatic and more human. Islamic gold dinars were, In that century, the most trusted and widely circulated gold coinage across the whole Mediterranean world struck to a reliable weight and a reliable purity, accepted from Spain to the edges of Asia. They were the gold standard, quite literally, the money everyone recognized and trusted on sight. If you were an English king who wanted his own gold to move and be accepted in the wider trading world to the south, where the dinar was king, striking a coin that looked and weighed exactly like the gold everyone already trusted, was simply good business. The Arabic, to Offa and his people, wasn't a statement of faith at all. It was a mark of quality, the same way a particular face or a particular mint stamp tells a trader the coin is good. Offa, or his moneyer, copied the most respected money in the known world, beautiful flowing script and all, and added the king's name on top because that is what you did. You put your name on your gold, so everyone knew whose authority stood behind it. The fact that the most respected money in the world happened to carry the central creed of a religion Offa had no connection to and no knowledge of was, in all likelihood, completely invisible to everyone on the English side. They could not read a word of it. To them, it was simply the look and the weight of real wealth. There was, for a while, a fringe idea floating around that the coin proved Offa had secretly converted to Islam, which would be an astonishing thing for an 8th century English king, and it would rewrite a fair chunk of history. It does not hold up. You don't advertise your secret conversion by also stamping your Latin Christian royal title upside down across the sacred text, garbling the Arabic in the process because you can't actually read your own profession of faith. The errors are the proof. A convert would have known what the words said. Offa's man didn't have the faintest idea, and that ignorance, captured in gold, is precisely what makes the coin so haunting to look at now. It's a message in a language the sender couldn't read, declaring a faith the owner didn't hold, and it sat in the world for over 1,000 years before anyone who could read both halves of it put them side by side and realized the quiet absurdity of what they were seeing. The single surviving example sits in the British Museum now, and the question of exactly why Offa wanted it has never been settled. Trade, prestige, a payment to Rome, simple imitation of the best gold going. Take your pick. The coin won't tell you, and the moneyer who could have explained has been dead for 1,200 years. And there's something almost sad in that lost craftsman when you sit with it. Some skilled engraver in Offa's England, a man good enough at his trade to be trusted with the king's gold, bent over his work and copied that flowing foreign script line by careful line, every loop and stroke of a language he had no way of reading, doing his honest best to reproduce a thing he could not understand. He had probably never met anyone who could have told him what it said. He almost certainly died never knowing that he'd spent a careful afternoon engraving the central creed of Islam onto the money of his Christian king, and then crowned it by jamming the king's own name in sideways across the holy words like a man signing the wrong line of a contract. He wasn't careless. He was the opposite of careless. He copied faithfully, which is exactly why the thing turned out the way it did. An accident born of diligence, a small masterpiece of getting something perfectly, beautifully wrong. Whatever Offa intended the coin to do, it has outlived its king, its kingdom, its language, and the man who cut it. And it still hasn't told anyone the one thing they most want to know. Staying in England and only a few generations removed in the long view of these things, we come to an object that's even bigger, even more famous, and somehow even more stubborn about giving up its secrets. Nearly 70 meters of it, in fact, stitched rather than woven, and arguing with itself about how a king died. The Bayeux tapestry isn't a tapestry, strictly. Since a tapestry is woven and this is embroidered, wool thread pushed through linen by hand. But the name has stuck for 900 years, so we'll let it stand. It runs about 70 meters long and only half a meter tall, a long, narrow strip of pictures with Latin captions. And it tells the story of how William, Duke of Normandy, became William the Conqueror, King of England, in the year 1066. The Norman Conquest, the Battle of Hastings, the arrow, the horses, the dead piled in the borders. It is one of the most important objects to survive from the entire medieval world, a comic strip 8 centuries before comic strips, and almost everything about how and why it was made is contested. Start with who ordered it, because even that isn't certain. The leading idea points to Bishop Odo of Bayeux, who was William the Conqueror's half-brother and a thoroughly worldly churchman, the sort of bishop who turns up on the battlefield swinging a club because, technically, a man of God isn't supposed to shed blood with a blade, and a club beats a man to death just as dead as a sword does. Odo features prominently in the embroidery, looking important at key moments, and 3 relatively obscure men who also appear in it, named Wadard, Vital, and Turold, can be matched to people who held land from Odo, according to the Domesday Survey. The thing was found in Odo's own cathedral at Bayeux, consecrated in 1077. So the case for Odo is decent, but it was very likely made in England, not Normandy, probably in Canterbury, by English embroiderers, because English needlework of that period was famous across Europe, the best money could buy, prized in Rome and beyond, and there are little tells in the spelling and the shapes of certain letters that point to English hands holding the needles. And that's worth sitting with for a moment. The years just after the conquest were England under the boot of a foreign army, the old aristocracy dead at Hastings or dispossessed and scattered, whole regions of the north about to be burned and starved into submission in the brutal campaign the Normans called the Harrying. And in a workshop in Canterbury, English women, almost certainly women given the craft, conquered people whose own king lay hacked apart in a grave somewhere on the coast, sat for months, maybe years, patiently stitching the triumphant official story of the men who had just destroyed their world. Some of them may have lost husbands or sons on that very battlefield they were now embroidering. We don't know what they thought as they worked. But a few scholars have wondered whether the little oddities, the cryptic scenes, the ambiguities about who exactly dies and how, might be the quiet handiwork of people stitching the victor's story while slipping their own meanings into the margins where no Norman lord would think to look. That's only a theory, but the basic situation is real and strange enough on its own. The defeated sowing the legend of their own defeat. Other theories float around, that Queen Edith, Harold's own sister and Edward the Confessor's widow, commissioned it as a careful act of survival under the new regime, that the designer was this abbot or that archbishop, And a recent study even argues the whole thing was meant to hang in a monastery's dining hall and be read like a moral lesson by the monks while they ate in silence. Nobody can prove any of it to the exclusion of the rest. Then there's the death of King Harold, and this is the one that's seeped into popular memory more than any other single moment in the whole thing. Before we get to the arrow, though, sit for a second with what the lower border of the tapestry actually shows during the battle, because that strip along the bottom is where the makers let the horror out. For most of the 70 meters, the borders are decorative, little animals and fables and patterns running along above and below the main story. But once Hastings begins, the bottom border fills up with the dead and the dismembered, severed heads, lopped off limbs, men stripped of their armor by looters, naked corpses being robbed where they fell, a figure bending to pull the mail shirt off a dead man because good mail was expensive and the dead had no further use for it. The main band shows the cavalry and the shield wall and the famous moments, but underneath, the embroiderers stitched what a real battle actually leaves on the ground, which is a field of broken bodies and the people who come afterward to take what's left. October the 14th, 1066, was a single day of fighting that ran from morning until dusk. And by the end of it, the English shield wall on Senlac Hill had been ground down, and Harold's housecarls, his sworn personal guard, lay dead in a ring around their king, having done exactly what they swore to do, which was to die where he died rather than leave him. And the death of the king is the moment everyone knows. Harold Godwinson, the last crowned Anglo-Saxon king of England, took an arrow in the eye at Hastings and died. And that's why you'll see him in 100 illustrations clutching at a shaft sticking out of his face. The tapestry seems to show it. There's a section near the end with the Latin caption that translates as, "Here King Harold was killed," and beneath the word Harold there's a figure gripping at an arrow that appears to be lodged in or near his eye, and a little to the right another figure is being cut down by a mounted Norman's sword. So far so clear. Except it isn't clear at all, and the more closely people have looked, the worse it's gotten. The problem is that the arrow may not have been in the original embroidery. The tapestry has been repaired and restored over its long life, and when scholars went back to the earliest careful drawings of it, made in the 1700s before some of the heavier restoration work, the figure under Harold's name isn't holding an arrow at all. He's holding what looks like a spear or a lance, pointed downward, with no feathered flight on it. The needle holes in the linen suggest that at some point something was there and was changed. An artist named Stothard, copying the tapestry in the early 1800s, seems to have looked at the marks and the legend everyone already knew and connected the dots into an arrow, and later restorers, working from his interpretation, may well have stitched the arrow in to match the story rather than the other way around. The fletching on that particular arrow doesn't match the fletching on any of the other arrows in the whole work, and the shaft bends at an unnatural angle to reach the figure's eye. None of that proves there was never an arrow, but it means the single most famous death in English medieval history might rest, at least in its visual form, on a restorer tidying an image to fit a tale. And the written sources don't rescue us either. The earliest account of Hastings we have, a poem called the Carmen, written very close to the event, doesn't mention an arrow at all. It says Harold was set upon by a group of Norman knights, 4 of them, who cut him down together and then went to work on the body in a way the poem describes in detail that's hard to read. One drove a lance through the king, one cut off his head, one opened his belly with a spear, and the 4th, the line says, hacked off the king's thigh, or by some reading something more deliberately obscene, carried away as a trophy. Whether William himself was one of the 4 is argued about, but the picture the poem paints is of a king not just killed but dismembered, taken apart by hand on the hill where he fell. And that created a genuinely grim problem afterward. When the fighting stopped and someone needed to find Harold's body among the heaped dead to do something with it, the corpse was so mutilated, so stripped and broken and mixed in with the other slain, that they couldn't identify the king by his face. The story that comes down to us is that they had to send for a woman, Edith Swanneck, Harold's longtime companion, the mother of several of his children, because she alone knew his body intimately enough to pick it out from the marks on it that only a lover would know. She walked the field of the dead, turning over bodies, until she found the man she'd shared her life with reduced to pieces in the mud, and identified him by signs on his flesh. The arrow in the eye only shows up in writing decades later, in the 12th century, in chroniclers like William of Malmesbury and Henry of Huntingdon. And there's a real possibility the arrow detail caught on partly because of a medieval idea that a man who broke a holy oath deserved to die by a blow to the eye, a fitting punishment for a perjurer. Harold had, the Normans insisted, sworn an oath to support William's claim, and then broken it by taking the crown himself. An arrow through the eye of an oath-breaker is almost too neat, morally. It reads like a sentence rather than an accident, so we're left genuinely unsure. Was Harold the man with the arrow, or the man being hacked down by the horseman, or were those 2 figures both meant to be him, the same king shown twice in sequence, first struck and then finished? Did an arrow ever touch his eye at all, or did a legend grow a shaft and then reach back across centuries and embroider itself into the cloth? The tapestry, which should be our best witness, turns out to be an unreliable one, edited by the very people who loved it. The end of the tapestry is missing too, and that absence is its own small mystery. The strip stops abruptly, in mid-flight really, with the broken English forces fleeing the battlefield and Norman riders cutting down the stragglers. Whatever came after, the aftermath, the conqueror's march on London, the submission of the surviving English lords, and almost certainly the great closing scene of William crowned at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day of 1066, is simply gone, lost off the end. An estimated few meters of embroidery torn or rotted or cut away at some point in the centuries since. And that lost coronation scene would have carried its own grim irony if it survived, because the real coronation at Christmas was a small disaster. When the crowd inside the abbey shouted out their acclamation of the new king, the Norman guards posted outside, not understanding the English and French voices roaring at once and fearing an ambush, panicked and set fire to the surrounding houses. So William was crowned King of England in a half-empty church, while the city burned outside the doors and people fled the smoke, the new reign beginning in fire and confusion. Whether the tapestry showed any of that or tidied it into something triumphant, We'll never know, because the maker's final word frayed away to nothing a long time ago, and every ending you've ever seen stitched onto it is a modern guess. Some of the strangest things in the tapestry, though, aren't the famous bits at all. They're in the quieter scenes and down in the borders, and they're strange because the people who made them clearly knew exactly what they meant, and we have completely lost the key. The most notorious is a small scene with a caption that reads, "Where a certain cleric and elf giver." That's it. That's the whole sentence. A woman named Elfgiva stands in a doorway, and a tonsured churchman reaches out and touches, or maybe strikes, her face. She is the only named woman in the entire 70 meters, given this one cryptic moment and no explanation. And directly below her, in the border, there is a naked man, crouched, genitals exposed, mirroring the pose of the cleric above him. For a long time, in polite reproductions, that little naked man was simply edited out, painted over, left off the copies, because nobody quite knew what to do with him. What is going on in that scene is one of the great unanswered questions of the whole object. The contemporaries who first saw it would have understood the reference instantly. It was clearly a scandal, a piece of gossip so well known it needed only a name and a gesture to call it to mind. The way you might today just say a single surname and a knowing look and everyone in the room gets it. But the gossip died with the people who knew it, and we are left staring at a woman, a clergyman's hand at her face, and a naked man squatting beneath her, with no idea what story binds them together. Scholars have spent the better part of 3 centuries trying to identify her, and the strongest single guess points to a woman named Ælfgifu of Northampton, who had been the first consort of King Knut, the Danish king who ruled England a generation before the conquest. And the scandal attached to her is exactly what gets whispered about a queen for decades. The rumor, written down by more than one medieval source, was that her 2 sons weren't really Knut's at all. One chronicle claimed that one boy was actually the child of a priest, smuggled into her bed and passed off as royal, and the other the son of a workman, a labourer, brought in the same way because she couldn't produce a true heir and didn't want to lose her position. A priest and a workman. Look back up at the embroidery, and there they are, the tonsured cleric reaching for the woman's face in the main panel, and directly beneath her in the border, the naked labouring man with his tools. If that reading is right, the makers of the tapestry stitched a piece of royal sexual gossip into the corner of their grand official history, encoding a decades-old slander about whose sons were really whose, in a way every contemporary would have caught, and we have to reconstruct like a code. Other scholars push different candidates, a different queen, Emma of Normandy, tied to her own rumoured affair with a bishop, or one of Harold's relatives, or an abbess caught up with a churchman. There's no agreement. The naked man has been read as everything from a crude joke about clerical lust to a satirical image of a man squatting in the posture of giving birth, mocking somebody's questionable parentage. A man absurdly delivering the illegitimate child the whole scandal was about. The truth is we have a scandal frozen in wool, complete with the punchline, and we've forgotten the joke. Whatever Ælfgiva did or had done to her was scandalous enough to make the official record of the conquest of England, and obscure enough now that the best minds working on it can only circle it. Even one of those little named men I mentioned earlier carries a puzzle, two-rolled. His name is stitched above a small figure holding the reins of two horses while envoys talk above him, and the figure is drawn unusually short, with proportions that several scholars have read as a person of short stature, a head and torso that take up a strange amount of his height, an adult's full beard on a child-sized body. One historian built a whole case that the name was carefully positioned to point specifically at this little man, lowered and tucked in right above his head, and argued that he mattered enough to someone to be singled out by name in an embroidery where most of the great lords go by completely anonymous. He even wondered whether this Turold could be the same Turold as the mysterious Turoldus named in the very last line of the Song of Roland, the poem we were standing in front of a little while ago with Charlemagne's sword, which would make this tiny stitched figure holding the horses a sly self-portrait of the man who designed the whole thing. That last leap is openly guesswork, a maybe balanced on a maybe, and other scholars say no. Turold is just one of the tall envoys standing nearby, and the short figure is no one in particular. But the basic oddity sits there and won't resolve. Someone thought this one small man holding horses was worth a name, in a work where kings and bishops and a whole conquest pass by unnamed, and we have no idea who he was, or why. Of everyone in the story, he was the one they chose to remember. And because no discussion of this thing is complete without it, there is a genuine, published, academic debate about how many penises are in the Bayeux Tapestry. I am not joking, and neither are the scholars. An Oxford historian went through the whole length of it, counting, and arrived at 93. The great majority of them belonging to the horses, with the largest of all attached, pointedly, to the horse ridden by William the Conqueror himself, which the historian reads as a deliberate statement about the Duke's virility and power projected onto his mount. A few years ago, another scholar challenged the count, spotting what he argued was a 94th, a human one, hanging beneath the tunic of a figure in the border, and described it in terms more anatomically enthusiastic than I'll repeat here. The first historian pushed back and said, no, that's a sword scabbard with a brass tip, not a body part. So the official tally stands somewhere between 93 and 94, depending on whether a particular dangling object is a man's anatomy or a piece of military equipment, and grown experts have genuinely gone to print over it. The Victorians, when they made their careful full-size copy of the tapestry, found all of this far too much and simply left the genitalia off entirely, gelding the horses and the men alike in the name of decency, which is its own small comment on how every age looks at this object and sees what it can stand to see. The cloth itself keeps yielding small revelations even now. A scientific study a few years back ran a hyperspectral camera over the whole length, reading more than 200 colors, and confirmed that the original dyes were the natural ones a medieval workshop would have used: madder for the reds, weld for the yellows, woad and indigo for the blues, plants and roots boiled into color and fixed into wool nearly 1,000 years ago. The same study pinned down that a major restoration happened in the 1860s and 70s, with some of the threads from that period being among the earliest synthetic dyes ever used to repair a work of art, which is part of why telling original stitching from Victorian repair has become its own delicate problem, and part of why the arrow in Harold's eye is so hard to rule in or out. And as I'm recording this, the tapestry is about to do something it has not done in 900 years. It's being loaned to the British Museum in London, opening in the autumn of 2026 and running into the summer of 2027, the first time the thing has been on English soil since English hands most likely made it, while its home museum in Bayeux is closed for rebuilding. After everything, the conquered going home to be looked at by the descendants of both sides at once. From a strip of cloth that argues with itself about a king's death, we turn to the sea and to an order of warrior monks who went from being the most feared and trusted men in Christendom to being burned alive in the space of a single generation, and whose lost ships have launched 10,000 fevered theories. The Knights Templar began as something almost humble, a small band of knights, 9 of them by tradition, sworn to protect Christian pilgrims on the dangerous roads of the Holy Land in the years after the First Crusade took Jerusalem. The roads to the holy places were genuinely lethal. Pilgrims who'd crossed the whole of Europe to pray where Christ walked were being robbed and murdered within sight of the city, picked off in the passes and the wilderness by bandits and raiders, sometimes slaughtered in groups of hundreds. The first Templars set themselves up to guard those roads, living as monks but fighting as knights, a combination that was new and a little shocking, holy men who killed. And over the better part of 2 centuries they grew into something enormous, a military religious order that was also, functionally, one of the first international banks in European history. A pilgrim could deposit money with the Templars in one country and withdraw it in another, carrying a piece of paper instead of a purse of gold that would get his throat cut on the road. Kings borrowed from them. They financed wars. They held land and castles and fortunes across the whole of Europe and the Levant. They answered to the Pope and almost no one else, exempt from local kings and bishops, a state within the states. And the men themselves, the frontline brothers, were genuinely terrifying on a battlefield, sworn never to retreat unless the odds against them were more than 3 to 1, sworn never to ransom themselves, which meant a captured Templar was usually a dead Templar. After the great defeats, Muslim commanders sometimes singled out the captured Templars and Hospitallers for execution precisely because they were the most dangerous and the most unbending, beheading them in batches while sparing ordinary soldiers. By the early 1300s, with the last Christian foothold in the Holy Land, the city of Acre falling in a horrific siege in 1291, this order of holy warriors had no war left to fight. The thing they existed for was gone. What remained was a great deal of wealth, a fortress network with no frontier to defend, and a great many enemies who eyed that wealth and that independence with something between envy and fear. The most dangerous of those enemies was the King of France, Philip IV, called Philip the Fair for his looks rather than his conduct, a cold and handsome man with a talent for legal cruelty. And Philip had a problem the Templars could solve, namely that he was deeply, desperately in debt, his treasury drained by his wars, and a good portion of what he owed was owed to the order itself. He had already shaken down and expelled the Jews of France and seized their property and squeezed the Italian bankers the same way, so the pattern was set. The Templars were simply the largest and richest target left standing. What followed is one of the coldest, most modern-feeling operations of the entire medieval period. Through the late summer of 1307, Philip's agents quietly prepared sealed written orders and carried them out to every corner of the kingdom, to royal officials in every district, with strict instructions that the seals were not to be broken and the contents not to be read until one specific dawn. The men holding the orders didn't even know what they contained. They only knew the date. That date was Friday, the 13th of October, and at first light that morning, all across France at once, in Paris and the provinces and the great Templar fortress of the Paris Temple itself, the seals were broken, the orders read aloud, and the king's men moved on the Templars in the same hour, kicking in doors, dragging knights and sergeants and chaplains out of their beds, before any warning could outrun the king's command. The simultaneity is the chilling part. There was no time for a single house to send word to the next. The Grand Master himself, Jacques de Molay, who had been in Paris and had, just the day before, served as an honored pallbearer at a royal funeral, walking beside the king as a respected man, was seized along with the rest. One day a guest at the king's side, the next a prisoner in the king's cells. It was efficient, ruthless and total, a coordinated dawn roundup that feels like it belongs to a much later, darker century. What came after the arrests is the part the romantic legend of the lost treasure tends to bury, and it deserves to be looked at squarely, because the vanished fleet story has a way of letting people forget what was actually done to these men's bodies. The charges were heresy of the most lurid kind. The Templars, it was alleged, denied Christ during their secret initiation rites, spat or trampled on the cross, worshipped an idol, a mysterious head sometimes called Baphomet, exchanged obscene kisses, and engaged in sodomy. And the confessions that supposedly proved all this were extracted by torture in the cellars and chambers of the French Inquisition on men who had taken holy vows. They were stretched on the rack until joints separated, the body pulled slowly apart at the shoulders and hips until something gave. They were hung by their arms twisted behind their backs, the strappado, the full weight of the body tearing at the sockets until the arms came out of joint. There's an account of one technique where a man's feet were greased and held to a fire until the flesh cooked, and the Chronicle says that in at least one case after this, the bones of the man's feet dropped out of his ruined flesh, and he carried them in afterward to show the inquisitors what they'd made of him. They were starved in their cells. They were kept from sleep for days on end, which sounds mild next to fire until you understand that enough of it unhinges the mind completely, and a man will say anything, sign anything, confess to anything at all, just to be allowed to close his eyes. And it killed people before any verdict was reached. Dozens of Templars simply died under questioning, or in the filth of their cells, broken by the torture or by the conditions, before the trials that were supposedly going to determine their guilt had even concluded. Confess they did, in France, in droves, hundreds of them admitting to spitting on the cross and denying Christ. In the places where the King of France couldn't reach, England at first, Cyprus, where torture wasn't applied the same way, almost none of them confessed to anything at all, and that difference says everything about what the French confessions were really worth. Men admitted to the worst sins their accusers could name, not because they'd done them, but because the alternative was another day on the rack or another hour with their feet in the fire. The whole monstrous edifice of the Templars' guilt was built brick by brick out of what men will say to make agony stop. And there's a document that makes the cynicism of it almost unbearable. A few decades ago, a researcher digging in the Vatican's secret archive found a parchment that had been misfiled centuries earlier and effectively lost, a record of a secret hearing the Pope's own agents held with the Templar leaders at Chinon in 1308. And what it shows is that the Pope, Clement V, having examined them, privately absolved the order's leadership of the charge of heresy. He found them, in confidence, not guilty. He gave them absolution. And then, a few years later, bowing to the relentless pressure of the King of France, he dissolved the entire order anyway, abolished it, handed it to the flames in everything but name, having already concluded in secret that the men were innocent. The piece of paper that could have saved them sat in the wrong box in the archive for nearly 400 years. Before the famous fire on the island, there was a larger one most people have never heard of, and it belongs in this story because it shows what the king was willing to do to keep the confessions coming. In 1310, in Paris, when it looked as though the order might actually mount a real defense, with brothers stepping forward in numbers to recant their forced confessions and insist on the order's innocence, the king's allies in the church responded by condemning 54 of these men as relapsed heretics, men who had taken back their confessions, and burning all 54 of them on a single day in a field outside the city. 54 men tied to stakes and set alight together. The accounts say that even in the fire, even with the flames already at them, the burning Templars kept crying out that they were innocent, that they had confessed only under torture and now died telling the truth, and that not one of them, in the agony of it, broke and admitted guilt to make it stop. They burned proclaiming the order's innocence with their last breath. And the effect was exactly what the king wanted. The mass burning terrified the remaining brothers out of their defense. Men who had been ready to fight the charges saw 54 of their own go up in smoke for daring to recant, and the resistance collapsed. After that, the trials ground on toward the verdict everyone already knew was coming. That horror is the real backdrop to the gentler, prettier story everyone remembers, the one about the ships. And alongside the documented suffering, there is the legend, and it is a good one, which is exactly why it's lasted. The story goes that the Templars knew or guessed that the arrests were coming. And on the night before that Friday the 13th, under cover of darkness, the Order's great fleet slipped out of the French port of La Rochelle. 18 ships heavy in the water, loaded with the accumulated treasure of the Templars, gold and silver and sacred relics and whatever secret the Order was supposed to be guarding, and sailed off into the night, and was never seen again. The ships and their cargo vanished from history, and ever since, people have tried to follow them. Some say the fleet went north to Scotland, where the Order found shelter, and where, the wilder versions claim, the treasure lies hidden still, and the Templar bloodline secretly continued, and where a few have even tried to tie surviving Templars to the Scottish army at Bannockburn. Some say Portugal, where, as it happens, the order genuinely did survive in a different form. Some have sent those ships clear across the Atlantic to the New World, centuries before Columbus, carving Templar crosses into stones in Nova Scotia, because once a legend gets going, there's no border it won't cross. Here's the trouble, told gently, because the real story is interesting in a quieter way. When you trace the lost fleet back to its actual source in the records, it shrinks dramatically. The whole thing rests, essentially, on a single piece of testimony from the Templar trials, from a man named Jean de Chalon, who said under questioning that he'd met a brother named Gérard de Villiers leading 50 horses, and that he'd heard it said this Villiers had put out to sea with 18 galleys, and that another brother had fled with the treasure of one of the Templar officials. Read that again carefully. He heard it said. It's second-hand. It's a thing he was told, repeated under the pressure of an inquisition, the least reliable conditions imaginable for getting at the truth. And crucially, the port of La Rochelle isn't mentioned anywhere in his testimony. That detail, the specific harbour that anchors the whole romantic image, was added by later writers, stitched onto the story long afterward. The 18 ships come from one frightened man repeating a rumour, the vanishing fleet of treasure, the midnight escape, the destination. Almost all of it is a structure built on top of that single line of hearsay. And the deeper problem is that the Templars don't seem to have had a great fleet to lose in the first place. Historians who've actually gone looking for the famous Templar navy keep coming back with the same unglamorous answer. The order owned a modest number of ships, transport vessels mostly, used to ferry men and horses and money and pilgrims back and forth to the Holy Land while it still existed, and when they needed to move a lot of cargo or troops across the Mediterranean at once, they generally hired ships from the great maritime cities, Genoa, Venice, Marseille, rather than maintaining a huge standing fleet of their own. It was cheaper and simpler to rent the hulls when you needed them. La Rochelle was a genuine Templar port on the Atlantic coast. That part is true, but its real business was the wine trade, shipping the wine of the surrounding region out to England and Flanders and the north. Ordinary barrels of ordinary commerce, not a hidden war fleet waiting at anchor for the night the order would need to vanish. The whole image of a mighty Templar armada, fleets of war galleys capable of crossing oceans and slipping away into legend and maybe even reaching the New World, is largely a creation of the 20th century, popularized by a handful of books that blended a little real history with a great deal of imagination and then got repeated until it felt like fact. There was no secret battle fleet sitting ready to make a dramatic midnight escape. There were, at most, a handful of ordinary ships scattered about the order's ports, and there is no contemporary record, none, of any treasure-laden squadron rowing out of any harbour in the dark on the eve of the arrests. What there is one terrified man under interrogation, repeating something he heard, and a story that grew and grew in the centuries after everyone who could have checked it was dead. Where did the actual wealth go then? Because there was real wealth, even if it was never a fleet's worth of gold. Most of it went exactly where you'd expect. Philip seized what he could lay hands on in France, and the whole operation had been about his debts from the start, so the king got his hands dirty enough to clear them. Across the rest of Europe, when the order was formally dissolved by the Pope in 1312, the bulk of its property, its lands and houses and holdings, was transferred by papal decree to another military order, the Knights Hospitaller, the Templars' old rivals, who absorbed the estates of the dead order across most of Christendom. It didn't vanish. It changed owners, mostly through paperwork, lawyers and clerks and seals rather than midnight ships. And in Portugal, the story took a turn that's stranger and better documented than any treasure legend. The Portuguese king, King Dinis, looked at the whole affair, at the torture and the forced confessions and the obvious greed driving it, and simply refused to destroy the order in his own kingdom. He held an inquiry that found the Portuguese Templars innocent, kept the men together, kept their castles and their lands intact, and a few years later reconstituted the entire thing under a new name, the Order of Christ. Same knights, same fortresses, same wealth. A different name over the door and a slightly different cross on the surcoat, and otherwise the Templars of Portugal walked straight out of their own abolition and kept going. Generations later, it was the wealth and the ships of that very Order of Christ, the rebranded Templars, that helped fund the Portuguese age of exploration, Prince Henry the Navigator himself running the order and pointing its resources out into the Atlantic, which is about the closest the famous Templar fleet ever really came to sailing off to discover the world. The Templars didn't disappear so much as get quietly rescued and renamed in the places where the local king saw through the charges. The grand lost treasure, the chest of secrets at the bottom of the sea or buried under a chapel in the Scottish hills, is the part that lives in books and not in the archives. The order, when it fell, was actually short of money. It had lost its entire reason for existing when the Holy Land went under, and a great deal of what it held was land and loans and paper promises, debts owed to it and by it, not sellers of coin you could load onto 18 galleys in a single night and row out into the dark. The men, though, the men were real, and what happened to them was real. Most of the order was broken, scattered, absorbed into the Hospitallers, imprisoned, or quietly released into other lives. Old soldiers with nowhere to go and a name that now meant heretic. But the leadership, Philip and the Inquisition, were not finished with. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, the old man who'd been taken on that first morning, had at one point confessed under the weight of his imprisonment, as nearly all of them did. He'd been in the king's cells for years by then, an old man worn down by isolation and pressure and probably worse, and like almost everyone else he had at some point signed the confession put in front of him, admitting the order's guilt, denying Christ, all of it. So the king's men expected the final act to be a formality. In the spring of 1314, they built a scaffold in the open square in front of the great cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, and they brought out de Molay and 3 other senior Templars to stand on it before a crowd, the plan being that the old leaders would publicly repeat their confessions one last time, confirm the order's disgrace forever in front of the whole city, and then be led quietly off to spend the rest of their lives walled up in prison. 2 of the 4 did exactly that. And then de Molay, who had spent 7 years a prisoner and had every reason to keep his head down and take the prison sentence, stepped forward and did the opposite. In front of the crowd, in front of the cathedral, he took it all back. He said the order was innocent. He said the confessions were lies, every one of them dragged out of broken men by torture, and that his own great sin, the thing he was truly guilty of, was having been coward enough to confess to falsehoods to save his own skin, betraying his brothers and his order with the lie. Geoffroy de Charlemagne, the preceptor of Normandy, stood beside him and said the same. The old man knew precisely what those words would cost him. Under the law of the day, a heretic who confesses and is forgiven, and then takes back his confession, is a relapsed heretic, and a relapsed heretic has exactly one sentence waiting, and it is the fire. He said it anyway. After everything they had done to him, the one thing the king could not get out of Jacques de Molay was a quiet ending. That same day, or within days of it, depending on which account you follow, Jacques de Molay was taken out to a small island in the Seine, in the heart of Paris, within sight of the great cathedral, and burned alive, together with another senior Templar, Geoffroy de Charlemagne, the preceptor of Normandy, who had stood beside him and likewise refused to lie. The executioners knew their craft, and the accounts agree that this fire was built to be cruel. They used slow-burning charcoal rather than quick faggots of wood, banked low so that the heat would build gradually, and the men would not be killed fast by a roaring blaze, but cooked by inches, the fire eating up the legs first and working its way slowly higher over a long, long time. De Molay was around 70 years old. And the thing the watchers remembered, the thing that got written down, was that the old man did not scream and did not beg. He asked, it said, to be turned so that he could face the cathedral of Notre Dame as he died, and to have his hands left free so he could fold them in prayer. He burned with a steadiness that frightened the people watching, an old man being slowly destroyed by fire and meeting it as though it were nothing, praying while his body was consumed from the feet up. When it was finally over and the embers had cooled, the people of Paris are said to have crept out onto the island in the dark to gather what was left of him, the ashes and the burnt scraps of bone, and carry them away as relics, treating the condemned heretic in the very hour of his execution as though he were a saint. And then there is the curse, the part everyone remembers, and it's one of those places where the legend and the documented facts brush up against each other in a way that's genuinely uncomfortable. The story says that from within the flames, as he burned, Jacques de Molay called out and summoned both of the men who had destroyed his order, Pope Clement V, who had dissolved it, and King Philip IV, who had hunted it, to meet him before the judgment seat of God within the year. He cursed them from the fire, he named them and called them to follow him into death. And the unsettling thing, the thing that has kept the curse alive for 700 years, is what actually happened next. Pope Clement died about a month later, in April of 1314, after a long and wretched illness. The accounts of his end are grim. He was tormented by some agonizing disease of the gut, and by one lurid story his corpse fared no better than his last days did, his body laid out overnight in a church where the candles set the bier alight, so that the dead pope was partly burned where he lay before anyone could put the fire out, the man who sent de Molay to the flames catching fire himself in death. King Philip the Fair followed that November, around 46 years old, struck down suddenly after a fall while out hunting, a stroke or a seizure that left this cold, controlled man wasting away, by some accounts unable to say what was wrong with him, dying by inches over weeks. Both of the men de Molay supposedly cursed from the fire were dead inside the year, exactly as the legend says. He promised they would be. And then the dynasty itself began to come apart. Now the careful historian has to add that the earliest sources are quieter than the legend. The oldest account of de Molay's final words has him calling on God for justice and predicting that those who wronged the order would answer for it, the sort of thing a condemned man facing the fire might well say, rather than the full theatrical curse with names and a deadline that later retellings supply. One chronicler told almost the identical story about a completely different Templar from Naples, which suggests the dramatic version got attached to de Molay because he was the famous one, the way good stories migrate to famous names. So the curse, in its polished form, probably grew in the telling, but the coincidence underneath it needs no embroidery at all. Pope Clement dead within weeks, King Philip dead within months. And then the dynasty itself coming apart in a way that genuinely shocked people at the time. Philip the Fair had 3 grown sons, and the succession of the House of Capet, which had held the throne of France in an unbroken father-to-son line for more than 3 centuries, looked about as secure as a thing can look. Within 14 years, all 3 sons were dead, none of them leaving a surviving son to follow him. The eldest reigned briefly and died young. The second reigned a few years and died, leaving only a daughter and a pregnant widow, and the child she finally bore was a boy who lived just 5 days before he died too. An infant king in his cradle gone before he could do anything but be born and buried. The third son reigned and died as well. The crown skidded sideways out of the direct Capetian line entirely for the first time in living memory, passing to a cousin's branch, and the bitter argument over whether it should instead have passed through the female line to the King of England helped light the long fuse that became the 100 Years' War. Generations of slaughter traceable in part to 3 brothers who couldn't produce a living heir between them. And there was a scandal threaded right through the collapse, the affair the French remember as the Tour de Nestlé, in which the wives of Philip's sons were accused of adultery, 2 of them found guilty and shut away to rot in prison, one of them dying there, while the 2 young knights they'd supposedly taken as lovers were seized, tortured, and then put to death in the most savage public way the age could devise, flayed, broken, and worse, their ruined bodies displayed as a warning. So in the very years after de Molay burned, the house that destroyed the Templars seemed to be devouring itself from the inside, its princesses disgraced, its heirs dying in cradles, its line guttering out like a candle. The French gave those rulers a name that stuck, the accursed kings. And whether you call it a curse or simply a brutal run of luck, you can understand why the people of the 14th century, watching the Pope and the King and then the King's whole line fall one after another, so soon after that slow fire on the island in the Seine, came away convinced that the old man in the flames had been telling the plain truth, and that something, somewhere, had heard him and answered. That fire went out 700 years ago, and we still don't agree on what burned in it, an order of guilty heretics or a brotherhood of innocent men destroyed for a king's debts, and we still can't say where their gold went or whether any ship ever left that harbour in the dark. That's where I'll leave you tonight. 5 stories, none of them tied up neatly, all of them still missing a piece, and honestly that's the part I like best, that there are still things this old we don't get to know. Thank you for staying all the way out here with me. It really does mean a lot, and if one of these got under your skin and you want me to dig into it on its own someday, drop it below and I'll keep a list. Get some rest if it's late where you are, drink some water, be good to the people around you. I'll see you on the next one.